Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us on our first webinar series for FindLaw.com Legal Answers. We are super excited that you are here today. Today's topic is an overview of laws that relate to pets and companion animals. I'm your host, Eric Sanchez, the social media manager for FindLaw.com. Our featured guest speaker is Kathy Hessler, a clinical professor of law from Lewis and Clark Law School in Portland, Oregon. Today's agenda includes going over a few housekeeping and introductions, and then we will jump right into our animal pet presentation. In the end, we will host a series of questions and answers live. All right, let's get started. You're probably wondering, what is FindLaw.com? Well, FindLaw.com is the world's leading provider of online legal information for consumers and small businesses. In fact, each month, more than 11 million people visit FindLaw.com seeking answers to legal questions. Our mission is to make law accessible and understandable for everyone. How do we accomplish this? We do this by providing relevant legal information and resources for everyone. Our Learn About the Law section on our site has thousands of current legal articles that are easy to read and understand. We also host the world's largest searchable lawyer directory listings with qualified local attorneys in your area. Before we get started, we want to go over a few housekeeping rules. During this webinar, we will be recording live. Don't worry, everything will be okay. At least we hope it will. Once the event is over, we will be sharing our live event via social media. Attendees will also receive the presentation and recording via email. All attendees are on mute, so no, we cannot hear you, but you can participate via chat option on your lower right-hand corner. So please, send us your pet-related questions as you think of them, and we will try to answer them as time allows. We want to remind you that we do not provide legal advice, so you will be monitoring all questions. What's a good question you might ask yourself? A good non-legal advice question could be framed like this. Can a dog owner be sued if their dog bites someone at a public place? A legal advice driven question could be, can I sue the person whose dog bit me? The last one is a no-no. I hope that kind of helped. At the end of the presentation, we will provide a list of links where you can view all pet-related laws directly on your mobile, desktop, or tablet device. And just in case you need legal help, we will also include a link to our largest online lawyer directory where you can search for top local attorneys near you. Also, at the end, please be on the lookout for a survey at the end of this webinar via email. We would appreciate any feedback as we prepare to launch our webinar series this year. Lastly, and I need to include this, please don't forget to follow us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, where we share exclusive legal content that connects you directly to our site. It is my great pleasure to introduce you Kathy Hessler, the Director of Animal Law Clinic at Lewis and Clark Law School. She is also the 2020 recipient of the Association of American Law Schools National Excellence in Animal Law Award. Kathy was also the first law professor in the United States hired to teach animal law full-time. Live from Portland, Oregon, here is Kathy Hessler.
Okay, can everyone see these slides? Just checking to see that my slides are up.
Everything looks great.
Okay, wonderful. Let me add my welcome to everyone who's joining us, and my thanks to Bridget, Eric, and Kelly, and the entire team at FindLaw and Thomson Reuters for inviting me to the inaugural event. I'm looking forward to having this conversation, and I think it's interesting that we're having it on National Dog Day, so that's kind of serendipity, perhaps. So I'm going to be talking about a number of things. I want to talk briefly about how we in the United States and increasingly around the world view animals as family. And there's dissonance between how we view animals and how the law views animals. And so I'll talk a little bit about our experience in the US with treating animals as family, and then the legal framework. And the legal framework I'm going to break into two categories: protecting companion animals, laws that are really designed to focus on the animals themselves and their care, and laws that are designed to protect the rights of the owners. And then we'll talk about a couple of other issues. So my introduction is I want to emphasize what Eric said. I can't give you specific legal advice. I'm not licensed in all of the areas in which you might live. So this is general education. The idea is to raise issues so that you know what to be thinking about and what to be asking about. And the laws are different in every jurisdiction. So when you have specific questions, it's important to check in your jurisdiction. I'm also not going to be talking about everything you possibly need to know about pets or companion animals. That's too much for one session. So again, this is an overview designed to raise some issues and information. And if there's some specific questions that I haven't touched on, and we have time at the end, I'm happy to talk about other areas as well. So I wanted to also, at the outset, talk about the difference in the title. We have companion animals and pets. And this is just to raise the issue of how we, again, are interacting with animals. Some people have thought that pet really focuses too much on this ownership construct with animals, and that companion really focuses more on the relationship that we have with the animals who live with us in our homes, and focuses a little bit more, or allows us to focus a little bit more on their care and their needs. And so sometimes that's a social shift, and sometimes that's actually a legal shift. There are some laws that are beginning to use the terminology companion animals when designating the kinds of animals who might be living with us in our homes. And that allows the courts also to focus a little bit more on the relationship value to us as opposed to an economic value. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. So which species are we talking about? So as you probably know, people have in their homes as companions or pets all kinds of animals. They have dogs and cats that people might know, and fish and rabbits and gerbils and hamsters and snakes and even insects, spiders. So there's all kinds of animals. Interestingly, the law doesn't always protect all of those species. The law tends to protect as a default mammals. So the cats, dogs, the rabbits, the gerbils, but not always. And not initially, but a little while ago, some states would only protect, for instance, cats and dogs and no other animals. And so you have to look very carefully at your state to see which species are protected. Two things to pay attention to. Sometimes the law just says animals, and it's not clear whether these broadly protect the more maybe exotic kinds of animals. And so sometimes the law needs to have some precedent to say, yes, we do protect those animals in order for the police or the prosecutors to take these animals into account. And sometimes these laws actually very specifically exclude certain kinds of animals. So you'd need to check in your jurisdiction to see which animals are covered. The other thing to know, obviously, is the reason we're talking about this is that we need to protect these animals. They're in our homes and we have duties and responsibilities toward them. I'm assuming that if you've signed into this webinar, it's because you care about these animals and you're interested in that. And that's a wonderful thing. So I won't go too much into the bad things that happen to these animals because that's depressing, and I'm assuming that people on this call are trying to avoid those things. But we'll talk about it a teeny bit later on. The other thing I wanted to mention is that science is evolving. We're having a lot more data about the capacities of the animals with whom we live. So their awareness, their self-awareness, their sentience, their ability to feel pain, but even their emotional and psychological capacities. And to the degree that we know that these capacities exist, then we have some duties to protect animals from harm resulting from their having these capacities. So that's an underlying sort of theme for the work that folks in animal law are doing. Okay, so let's talk about animals as family. In the US, and again, this is increasingly true around the world, but I'm focusing on US statistics. So we do treat companion animals as family members in about 67% of US homes, and that's 84 million homes, have animals that they're considering pets or companion animals. That means nearly 400 million animals. That's a lot of animals. And so when we're talking about laws that apply to these animals, we're talking about a really significant set of activities. Of the 400 million, there's approximately 140 million freshwater fish. So again, we have really different kinds of animals in our homes. The three most popular categories of animals are fish, cats, and dogs in that order in terms of numbers of animals in our homes. Of the people who have animals in their homes, depending on what study you look at, 91 to 99% of those people consider these animals their family members. Just one example, 60% of millennials who have companion animals are buying clothes for these animals and treating them in that way as family members. And in business, people are beginning to recognize this relationship too. Hotels and restaurants are increasingly accepting animals on their premises because that's what people want them to do. They want to travel as a family, and that includes their companions. We spend an awful lot of money in this exercise of treating animals as our family members. So in 2019, the figure was $95.7 billion. And so some of that is, of course, on the kinds of things that you would think, just food and traditional veterinary care and those kinds of things. On the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see all kinds of things that people are spending money on. So special food, clothes, bedding, housing, jewelry, medical care, the kind that you might think of, and advanced care, meaning chemotherapy and massages and all kinds of things. Therapy, vacations, insurance, spa days, funerals, gifts, parties, and toys. And the estimate is that in the US we'll be spending about $99 billion this year on animals. That was the estimate before coronavirus hit, so that number could be a little bit higher. Why do we live with animals as family? Why do we consider them as members of our family? We have relationships with these animals. So independent studies and also families report that there are significant benefits from having animals in their home. Companionship, love, affection, but there are also studies indicating significant health benefits, including therapy and assistance animals, and I won't be talking about them because that's an entirely different or additional sort of legal construct. But for the animals we treat as regular companion animals, they have been shown to reduce cholesterol, blood pressure, depression, aggression, anxiety, stress, and increase activity, alertness, calmness, immunity, and happiness. So people are finding some very significant benefits, not just they feel good and they like the animals, but actually studies have shown there are actual immunological and other kinds of benefits that people have from living with animals. People also say they have animals as family members and in their homes as a hobby, as a conversation piece, to teach children responsibility, to do some labor for them, to keep other undesirable animals away. And only 8 to 10% of animals who animal owners say that there's no benefit, which is an interesting statistic because then I'm not sure why they have the animals. But one particular category of animal is exotic animals. There are some significant challenges in owning exotic animals. They are legal in some states and they vary really widely. So we have a really small guy here in the picture, but people have had tigers, bears, all kinds of animals that aren't really well suited to living with people in their homes. It's really difficult to get good veterinary care for these animals because your general veterinarian may not know what's appropriate for them. People typically don't know what's right, how to handle them safely for themselves or for the animal's well-being. They can be dangerous to people and to other animals. If they leave the home environment, they can be invasive. Most people are aware of the snake situation in Florida. They're often treated really poorly when they're being either bred or taken from the wild and during the sales process, and many of them are brought to the country illegally. And obviously all of this behavior is very stressful for the animals themselves. So for those folks who are thinking about exotic animals, you would probably want to check first to see what kind of rules there are in your state to see what's legal and what's not legal. And then you'd want to check and see how animals are being treated if you're trying to purchase them. Okay, some quick trends. Because we are engaging with our companion animals in so many new ways, there are things like activity trackers, so like a Fitbit for your animal to see how active they are as a measure of their health and well-being. There are services to take care of them when we're not around, apps for pet sitting, boarding them, for walking them, and even things like automatic litter scoopers and food dispensers that they can manipulate and use themselves when we're not in the home. There's also internet video cameras. These are really interesting to look at, sort of like you would see a baby monitor with a video, but that can be operated by dogs. They can sort of push a button and communicate, or at least visually see you. There are smart leashes to track distance and time walking. There's new food and supplements for the health and well-being of animals. There's new really growing field for assistive devices for injured animals. That's a wonderful thing. And there's a growing availability of CBD food and treatments products for animals. And I would just urge caution here because there really aren't very many studies about the impacts of CBD on the animals, and the products really vary very widely in the content, the strength, the dosage, those kinds of things. And so just be cautious about, some trends are good, some you have to be a little more careful of. Okay, so in general in society, we find that we're humanizing companion animals more, and this is driving the development of the pet industry. So as we've said, people are treating them more the way they treat their family members, and the industry is counting on that increasing income and spurring that, right? So they're supporting that kind of change. That change doesn't necessarily reflect itself in the law in the same way, and certainly not at the same speed. So the idea is that animals are property under the law, and they can be owned. And there's this dissonance between how we're treating them and how the law is treating them, and the law is evolving. It's evolving slowly, but it is evolving. We can get harm from people who hurt our animals. Law enforcement's taking the harm of these animals more seriously. The law itself is using terms like companion animals and guardian as opposed to owner. And courts are letting people make decisions that they think are best for the animals and starting to honor those agreements. Also, as I've said, science is evolving, and the courts are beginning to be aware of and take seriously the scientific data that helps us understand what an animal's needs are, and therefore when it might not have been met. So the law is changing. It's slower, but it is changing. So let's focus on some of that right now. So again, I'm going to mention a number of times, animals are property. Even under the best circumstances, they're still considered property. So we have this really odd dissonance, again, even within the law. So some jurisdictions will recognize animals as sentient, and that means they can feel, and that means they can feel pain, which means we shouldn't be causing them pain unnecessarily. And Oregon, the state that I'm in, is one such state that recognizes in the law that animals are sentient. It also recognizes that animals can be victims of crime. And that's really important because a long time ago, there was a lot of conversation about whether anti-cruelty laws were designed to protect society as a whole from the harm when someone is acting violently towards anything, towards inanimate property, towards animals, towards people, and that the goal was to stop that kind of violent behavior, or whether the goal was really to protect the beings who could be harmed. There's some disagreement about what the original intent was, but certainly the legislature in Oregon decided it doesn't really matter where we started. What we think now is animals can be harmed, and so we want to protect them from harm. And that means even harm caused by their owners. And that's a really important point. Having said that, they're still property. So they're sentient, but they're still property. So this is an area that animal legal advocates are working on. What does it mean when we're talking about harm or neglect or abuse? There's a lot of latitude in the state's designations, descriptions, and what the police and prosecutors are going to take seriously. They have an awful lot of other work they consider that is important, and so sometimes animal cases are not a really high priority. And so sometimes there's private enforcement that can happen, and public humane societies sometimes take on that role for jurisdiction. Okay, so looking at some of the laws now, we have the laws that are protecting animals designed to really focus on their health and well-being. We'll go through some of these individually. So I've mentioned anti-cruelty laws and that they vary state to state, and that's again really important to figure out. So which animals are protected and what is protected or prohibited in each of those states. So typically they prohibit abuse and neglect, torture, and then sometimes very specific types of harm. And for example, hoarding. So for a long time, people didn't really understand that hoarding was in every instance harmful for the animals. So hoarding is when someone has basically too many animals and they can't care for each of those individual animals in the way that they need to. So hoarding situations are now regarded as harmful to animals and sometimes specifically outlawed in a state. Some of the anti-cruelty laws don't protect all animals. Again, they may not protect fish or reptiles, amphibians, different kinds of animals, and they don't apply to all animals. So there's usually explicit exclusions for animals used for food or research or hunting, and sometimes even wild animals. Again, not every state. Some states will protect these animals. Some states will protect certain animals in these categories and not other animals in these categories. Some states are a little silent, so it's not really clear whether they do or they don't. So this is an evolving area of law. And if you're interested in finding out what's happening in your jurisdiction, you should check with people who are working there. Another thing to mention is the link between harm to animals and harm to humans. This is something that's been studied for decades, and it's clear that there's a link. So people who tend to harm animals also tend to harm humans. Sometimes animals first and moving on to humans, and sometimes in the other direction. So the idea is that even if people don't care about animals in particular, whether that's society, police, prosecutors, judges, they should care about this harm because it's often an indicator of other harm. And if we stop one kind of harm, we might be able to prevent other harm. Okay, some quick examples that are a little bit more distinct. Leash and tether laws. We have laws that say you can't tether your dog outside for too long without access to clean water in certain poor weather conditions. And so that's for the dog's protection. And the leash requirements in public are also for the dog's protection and for the protection of others. There are also rules that say you can't leave animals in dangerous conditions, including hot cars. We've all seen some terrible news items about that. And in some states, the law allows other people to break into a car if they've tried everything else first to find the owner and so forth, to rescue that animal because that animal might die. And so, again, you'd have to check your state. Violations of anti-cruelty laws can result in criminal penalties. They can be misdemeanors or felonies. Again, there's general weather considerations. So even when you're not on a tether, when the animal's not on a tether, you can't leave them outside when it's too hot or too cold or for too long. And they need access to water and shelter. And courts have said things like, if the water bowl is frozen, that's not water, that's not appropriate. And these things unfortunately happen. Abuse or neglect under the law usually is defined as behavior that results in harm or damage to the body, requires a need for medical intervention or malnutrition or some other things. And again, those laws are going to be specific to your state. Some other anti-cruelty issues that people may not know about. Apparently, tattooing and piercing animals became popular a little while ago, and so there's a New York City ban, and it doesn't seem to be as popular. It seems to be declining in popularity, which is good, but it's obviously very painful and problematic for the animals. People often dye animals' fur or even sometimes feathers, and they think that it's harmless, and it's not, especially for animals who groom. So the dye is problematic. There are a number of issues that the animals can have negative reactions to their skin and so forth. There's also glow-in-the-dark genetic modifications. That's the fish you see on the bottom right-hand side of the screen. And so this is essentially making these fish sort of like night lights, sort of, again, conversation pieces, if you will. It has no sort of thought about how this impacts the welfare of these animals. And so the more that we decide to manipulate the animals we want to live with for our entertainment and pleasure, the more we actually have to be thinking about the welfare of the animals. And then I've added these things called cyanide bombs that people may or may not be familiar with. So Federal Wildlife Services often plant these devices in the woods to kill predators or pest animals, animals they've decided they don't want. And often dogs and sometimes humans set these traps off and are harmed. And so there was a recent, just last week, settlement in Idaho for $40,000 for the death of a family's dog as a result of these. Okay, so the need for protection, very quickly, because I think most people are pretty well aware of some of these things. Every 60 seconds, an animal suffers abuse in the United States, and close to 65% of those abused animals are dogs. Every year, more than 10 million animals die from abuse in the US alone. It's a very, very large number. And 250,000 animals every year are victims of hoarding. Over 10,000 puppy mills in the United States exist, and the conditions in which those animals live are significantly problematic, really, really egregiously poor, generally speaking. And there are also external consequences. So 1/3 of parrot species are in danger of extinction because of the exotic bird trade. Coral reefs and oceans are damaged for the exotic fish trade. So these are problems that are related to our desire to have these animals in our homes that we need to be cognizant of. Some laws also require proactive care, though it's usually pretty basic. So the law may say that appropriate housing is required. That can include outdoor housing, it can include really tiny cages. It doesn't usually establish rules for many animals, but even the animals that are included, there really aren't sometimes terribly high minimum thresholds. Food and water, again, potable water and sufficient food to maintain health. You can imagine that that's up to interpretation. And basic medical care is expected, but there are exceptions. One really interesting exception perhaps might be for people who decide they want to kill a cat or dog. And you can do that. You can ask for a vet to kill or euthanize an animal for no reason, for a bad reason. Usually vets will still do this, not always now. And you can actually, people can kill animals themselves as long as they don't cause its suffering. So it needs to be instantaneous. So this is an interesting aspect of our laws, that we are now treating animals like family members, but when in some instances people get tired of them or are upset with them, they can just kill them. And that's by and large still legal. Okay, future planning. So it used to be difficult to figure out how to take care of your animals after you passed on. You could tell people what you wanted to do, but usually you couldn't make it enforceable under the law. And now every state has laws, they're usually called pet trusts, that allows you to leave money to care for the animals after you die. And so these are legally enforceable now, and that's really a wonderful step forward, and that's in the past, say, 10 years or so. And every jurisdiction, again, is a little bit different. It's important to look at what might be the rules in your jurisdiction and to develop a plan and think about what you want to have happen. Likewise, you can appoint guardians to care for your animals. If you're ill, generally this is for after the death of an owner, but it can occur in other instances. And people should be thinking about not just what happens when they die, but if they go into hospice care or some other kind of care, what's going to happen to their animals. And again, planning is really key to avoiding problems in those situations. There are a number of guides available state to state that help you think about what is best for you and what are the questions you should be asking and answering in this regard. Okay, some more laws that are focusing a little bit more on the focus of owners, really. So custody, this idea that when people get divorced, the courts divide up marital property. Again, animals are property, so how do you divide up the animals? So the ownership's not always clear, and people have asked the courts for help. The ownership maybe the husband bought the dog for the wife, maybe the wife is the one who does all the work, even though hasn't purchased the animal, but takes care of the animal. How do you figure these things out? Dogs and cats and fish don't come with like ownership certificates. And so if the parties can't agree, then the courts can say, well, I'm going to designate that the dog or cat goes with this party or that party. And that's it. That's the end of the story. And sometimes they could say whatever value that animal is could be offset towards the other party. But that doesn't work really well for animals, right? You can't split an animal like you could split a record collection maybe, and you can't value the relationship in the same way that you could a house or something like that. So 3 states have moved on to legislation to address this problem, Alaska being the first, passing this law in 2017. They have said that judges in divorce proceedings must consider an animal's well-being. Now, must consider doesn't necessarily say what happens after they consider it, but this is a huge step forward. So they're recognizing that animals are a different kind of property and that they have well-being that need to be considered. And so Alaska includes all animals except sled dogs and rodeo animals in the protection of this law. And they specifically wanted people to realize this wasn't a custody situation, it's joint ownership. And so that was the first one, and they helped other states look forward to passing these laws. Illinois passed the next one and said, again, judges must consider the well-being of the companion animal. They broadly define animal. They haven't really dealt with the visitation issue yet, and they've specifically said the animals are still considered property, but it's a different kind of property from inanimate property. California, the parties on their own may determine ownership or require care from one another for the animal, or the court may do that. And here they're using the term custody, which is pretty shocking in a way, right? It's a very big leap forward. And they may consider who took care of the animal during the relationship. The state decided this was a really important thing because 20% of the cases, even back in 2014, had this issue that needed to be addressed. Okay, tenancy. I'm sorry, I'm going to go through really quickly some of these things just so that we have some time for questions. So there are a lot of restrictions for rental properties and condos for animals based on species, size, breed. They may require pet deposits. They may completely ban animals. All of those things have been ruled legal in many jurisdictions and have also been challenged. And homeowners themselves also, there may be bans in the jurisdiction in which you live. And again, those have been challenged. There are exceptions in both these circumstances, whether you rent or own for service animals. Adoption and foster is a whole conversation that we could be having because it's really different agency to agency, private and public. Foster is basically this temporary care of animals that can become permanent through adoption, and adoption contracts have really expanded in the kind of terms that they now have. They may not actually grant you full ownership of the animal, meaning that if you've decided that you can't care for the animal, they have a right of first refusal for rehoming. That means the animal has to come back to them. You can't just give that animal away or sell that animal. And they may contain medical or other care requirements. And so this is different than outright purchasing, where those contracts can be really specific, but they give you ownership right away. Veterinary malpractice is something to be thinking about. There's a shift in veterinary medicine. It used to basically focus on the owner as the client, and now it is looking at the welfare of the animal as well as part of their professional responsibility. There's still some things that veterinarians are willing to do when they're paid to do it, like tail, ear docking, nail removal, euthanasia, that one might argue is not in the best interest of the animals. So those standards are evolving. The vets tend to think that animals are worthy of the cost of care, paying them. Sometimes, though, when the lawsuits happen, they say the animals really have no value. And so that ends up being challenging in the legal setting. Torts and contracts. So these are legal concepts. Basically, a tort is when someone harms you or your animal, and a contract breach is someone just not honoring the deal that you made. And so you might have potential problems with groomers, daycare folks, dog walkers, pet sitters, those kind of people. And so you can sue for damages in general terms. You might sue for the value of the animal. It might be the lost value, the special value, the replacement value of that animal. Some states, value is not going to really work. You can sue for medical care that it was caused, that needed to happen from someone's actions. And then you as owners also liable for harm or damage that your animals were causing to other people, other animals, or property. Lost animals. So generally speaking, owners have a duty to look for their animals, and it's problematic the longer that they don't find their animals. Shelters have hold time, sometimes 3 days after that they can rehome animals or euthanize them. And people who find animals are supposed to also look for the owners. And sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, and the longer they have animals, the more challenging it can be to get them back to their original owners. Emergencies, a lot of conversation right now about emergencies. So we have some federal law and we have some state laws around this. The most important thing is just to understand that in emergencies, some things change, right? And so there are a lot of people who might be rescuing animals and it's hard for them to get back to the original owners. And so that complicates the conversation quite significantly. And we can talk about that more later if you'd like. Lastly, I just wanted to mention COVID-19. And so right now it's challenging for animals. Some of them are getting way too much exercise, too little exercise. There's a lot of stress at home. The masks, for dogs in particular, are confusing and sometimes it feels a little threatening. A lot of people are adopting or buying fostering animals right now because they're home. And so folks are pretty concerned about what's going to happen if these folks go back to school and work. Who's going to take care of the animals? How are they going to transition to what the animals have become accustomed to? And the families as well. The challenge will be in the transition. A lot more people are trying to help animals. Animals in shelters during the coronavirus has been really challenging. And there is some concern about disease transmission. So folks are worried about whether they can get it from animals or they can give it to animals. Both of those things have happened in very rare instances, and it's not really clear exactly what the transmission models are. People are looking at that, but right now it doesn't seem like things that we have to worry about. So that's a quick tour through, hopefully not too quick, and we'll have time for questions. Thank you all for attending, and I'll shift it over now to questions. Let's see. So I'm looking through the questions. So the first question is about municipalities requiring the animals to be held for a certain number of days. So the question is asking whether there are federal state laws that would make it illegal to rehome a stray without going through the shelter. So first thing overall, there are very, very few federal laws that apply in the companion animal context. So there's a PETS Act that's being proposed that actually passed really recently, but it's very, very narrow and it doesn't deal with this in many, many circumstances. So each state is going to have a different law in general about what happens with lost property. So it's the same in a way. If you find someone's purse, right, are you allowed to keep that or to dispose of it one way or another without trying to go through a process? And usually the answer is no. It is not your property. You know it's not your property, so you can't just rehome that animal without, whether it's the municipal authority or whether there's someone they've designated to handle these issues. So you need to be touching base with those folks and figuring out what's appropriate. I hope that answers that question. What's being done to stop online posting cruelty to pets? That's a really good question. So that is the one thing that there's some federal law about. So there's something called the crush, animal crush videos. I won't go into details. You can look it up if you want to. I suggest you don't. It's really, really disturbing. It's where it's a sexual fetish where people, women's feet or women in high heels are literally shown crushing animals to death, right? It's really, really disturbing. And so that's been a really hard thing for prosecutors to work on. And so there is federal law that now covers that. And then they said, okay, now can we cover some more things beyond that? And so that's what the recent PETS Act has done. So it goes a little bit beyond that category, and it does take into account explicitly things that are happening online. So it's not as broad as we would like it to be. It's not all of the acts, and so absent federal law, people can still make complaints to, like, say, Facebook or YouTube or whatever, where these things are happening. And the more that people are able to do that, the better, because then the platforms will begin to understand they really need to control this content, and that would be very helpful. So, okay, let's see what else is questions. Let's see, so looking at another question about abandonment. So someone's asking about trap, neuter, and release. And it says, Wichita has no trap, neuter, release laws in place, even though a society is actually is providing those services, and how is that legal? So this is another good example of the law has all these holes for animals, right? And so sometimes if there's not a law that says you can't do something, you can do it, right? And so if it's not deemed cruel, and I think in most jurisdictions, people would say trap, neuter, and release is not cruel, although there are some people who think that neutering animals is cruel. But if it's not going to fit under the designation of cruelty, then it's not law enforcement looking the other way. It's that they have no jurisdiction over managing these animals. And we're talking usually about feral animals, and these animals fit into more the wild animal category than the companion animal category. And so again, most of the laws that we've just been talking about don't apply to these animals at all. Again, gaping holes in the protection, the legal protection for animals. But good question. Any changes coming to laws addressing companion animals caught up in domestic violence cases? Yes. So there's really good news on that. So I'm glad you asked that question. Sorry, I didn't include it in the main presentation. More than half of the states in the United States already have laws that allow animals to be included in protective orders for domestic violence. And so that means when there's domestic violence in home, if I'm the victim of domestic violence and I have a dog, the order can have my abuser stay away from me, stay away from my dog, my kids, the home, what have you. And it used to be that animals were not included, and especially problematic if the dog was owned, right, by the abuser. But right now, in more than half the states, animals are allowed to be protected, and this is very, very important for two reasons. So one, it's important for the safety of the animal and to be away from the abuser, but two, it's really important for the safety of the human beings, because some people, studies have shown, stay in violent and abusive situations because they can't get the animal out of the home and they're afraid that they'll be harmed, right? And so they're staying and they're putting themselves in danger until they have an escape plan. And so allowing animals to go with the victims of abuse provides more safety for both, and that's just a really good social benefit. So that's something that has been evolving, which is a really nice thing. And I'll say that I'm very pleased. The first state in the country to do that was Maine, and they were able to use a law review article written by one of our law students at Lewis and Clark to support that legislation. So if you think that one person can't make a difference, don't doubt it, that you really, really can. So, okay, let me see if there are some other questions. Have states adopted laws affording greater protection for animals that have learned to communicate? The answer is no, sadly. So the question refers to Coco the gorilla, and there was Alex the parrot. There are these animals who have stunningly, people think animals are stupid, and these are animals who not only know how to communicate with one another, they've learned how to communicate with us in our language, right? In English or in English Sign Language. So that should be, I think, taken seriously as a sign of their intelligence, and that means we need to protect these animals, right? They actually understand some of the harms that are happening to them. But that language capacity isn't one of the things that's right now an element of the law for legal protection, and that's good and bad. So one, we should really be protecting animals more carefully when we understand they have these high capacities. However, we should actually protect all animals, whether they can speak to us or not. And so to some degree, I'm okay with that not being an element that's required for protection. If we want to make it an element that increases protection, maybe that's a way to go. But it'd be good for people to understand that all animals have the ability to communicate. Whether they can communicate in our language with us is a separate question. And I think most people who have animals in homes recognize that animals can communicate. There are even studies that fish learn to recognize the names that we call them and can differentiate between human faces and actually have long-term memories and these kinds of things that people don't always know. So, so the short answer is no, and that's sort of good and bad. I think we may have time for one more question. And so I will, let's see, puppy mills. Yeah, some pet stores have taken animals from puppy mills. More and more reputable pet stores are not. And so you can check with the, most of the reputable pet stores will have online their guidelines about their sourcing, it's usually called, of animals. And you can see online what their sourcing policies are. And if it's not online, you can call them up and ask them. If they don't talk to you about it, then don't do business with them. They should be letting you know where the animals are coming from and not coming from puppy mills. Having said that, some people describe things as not puppy mills when they really are, and so it gets a little bit challenging. So it may take a little more sleuthing on your part, but it's good to ask that question. Okay. I think, and Eric can give me the thumbs up, I think we might need to stop at that point. Yeah, okay, so I will stop. Do I need to screen share the last slide, Eric?
No.
Okay, great. Okay, then I'll stop. Thank you, everyone.
All right, that was some great stuff. So thank you again, Kathy. I mean, $95.7 billion spent on companion animals alone. Yikes. I have a black app and I know where I'm spending my money on. We want to say thank you to our guest speaker, Kathy Hessler from Lewis and Clark Law School, and everyone joining us remote today. Just a reminder, FindLaw.com is here to help you with all your legal needs. We are the world's leading provider of online legal information and for everyday consumers and small businesses. To learn more about pet laws, please visit our site at public.findlaw.com and view our Learn About the Law section. We will also provide an email with all of our top pet content of articles and blogs that include dog laws, service animal laws, exotic animal laws, buying a pet, and what is animal cruelty. If your question wasn't answered during the live event, we plan to get back to you within the next day or two. You will have access to all slides and the recording via email a day after the event. Please pass our presentation along to anyone who may be interested in animal laws. Again, happy National Dog Day, and thanks again for attending our webinar. We hope you have a great day.